They say the deepest heartbreak is not when someone leaves, but when they leave while looking you in the eyes and telling you it is your fault. The afternoon my husband walked out of our home with a woman young enough to be our daughter, the entire neighborhood believed I had lost everything that mattered. 3 years later, the same man stood on my front porch with tears in his eyes, asking for one more chance. But that day was still far in the future. On the afternoon it all began, I stood quietly in the kitchen arranging fresh roses in a glass vase, completely unaware that the life I had spent 34 years building was only minutes away from collapsing. The windows were open, letting the warm breeze of early September drift through our little white farmhouse on the edge of a peaceful Midwestern town. The scent of freshly cut grass mixed with the fragrance of the roses Richard had planted for me during our 10th wedding anniversary. I smiled as I trimmed another stem, thinking about the pot roast slowly cooking in the oven because Friday evenings had always been our family dinner night, even after our children had grown and started families of their own. Grace usually called before arriving, and Daniel often stopped by after work carrying my favorite apple cider from the local market. Those evenings had become my favorite tradition because they reminded me that although our children no longer lived under our roof, our home was still the place where everyone belonged. I heard Richard's car pull into the driveway nearly an hour earlier than usual. At first I felt pleasantly surprised, imagining he had simply finished work ahead of schedule. I wiped my hands on a kitchen towel and walked toward the front hallway with the same welcoming smile I had worn for decades. The smile disappeared the moment I opened the front door. Richard was not alone. Standing beside him was a young woman with long dark hair, elegant clothes, and an awkward expression that suggested she already knew she should not have been there. Richard avoided my eyes while carrying 2 suitcases from the trunk of his car. For several long seconds no one spoke. I looked from the luggage to the unfamiliar woman and finally back to the man I had shared more than half my life with. "Richard," I asked quietly, "what is happening?" He sighed heavily, as though the conversation had become an inconvenience he wished to finish quickly. "Evelyn, we need to talk." Those 5 words felt colder than any winter I had ever known. We sat in the living room while the young woman remained outside near the driveway. Richard folded his hands together before speaking with a calmness that hurt far more than anger ever could. "I have not been happy for a long time," he said. "I deserve a chance to start over." I stared at him, waiting for the rest of the sentence, convinced there had to be some misunderstanding. Instead, he quietly explained that he had fallen in love with someone else, someone who made him feel young again, someone who still had dreams he wanted to chase. Every word landed with unbearable weight, yet I never raised my voice. I simply asked the only question my heart could still form. After 34 years together, is this truly how our story ends? Richard finally looked directly at me before answering with words I would never forget. "You will never be happy without me, Evelyn. One day you will understand that leaving is the best thing for both of us." Then he picked up his suitcases, walked out the front door without looking back, and left the silence of our home louder than any goodbye. For the first few minutes after Richard drove away, I remained standing in the middle of the living room, listening to the silence he had left behind. It was astonishing how quickly a home filled with 34 years of shared memories could suddenly feel unfamiliar. The clock above the fireplace continued ticking with perfect indifference while the pot roast slowly finished cooking in the kitchen, filling the house with the comforting aroma of a family dinner that would never happen. I walked to the dining room and quietly set 4 plates on the table out of habit before realizing there would be no reason for anyone to gather that evening. My hands froze as I looked at the empty chairs where Richard, Grace, and Daniel had laughed through countless Friday dinners over the years. One by one I carried the unused plates back into the cabinet without allowing myself to cry. A few minutes later my telephone rang. It was Grace. She sounded cheerful at first, asking if she should bring dessert on her way over. I closed my eyes for a brief moment before answering as calmly as I could. "Sweetheart, perhaps we should postpone dinner tonight." She immediately sensed something was wrong. "Mom, are you all right?" I hesitated, searching for words that did not seem to exist. "Your father has left." The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. "What do you mean he left?" she finally whispered. I explained only the simplest facts. Richard had packed his belongings. He had chosen another life. He was not coming back. Grace insisted she and Daniel would come immediately, but I gently asked them to stay home for the evening. I need a little time, I told her. Tomorrow will still be there. After ending the call, I slowly wandered through every room of the house. Richard's closet stood half empty. His favorite coffee mug was gone. The framed photograph from our anniversary trip had disappeared from his bedside table. I noticed small absences everywhere, each one quietly confirming that this had not been an impulsive decision. He had been preparing to leave for far longer than I had ever realized. That night I could not bring myself to sleep in our bedroom. Instead, I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and sat on the porch swing overlooking the rose garden. The flowers glowed softly beneath the porch light, just as they had every autumn since Richard planted them years earlier. I wondered how someone could nurture roses with such patience while allowing a marriage to wither without saying a word. Around midnight, Lucy, my elderly neighbor from across the street, noticed the porch light still burning. She quietly walked over carrying a small kettle of chamomile tea. She did not ask questions. She simply sat beside me and poured 2 cups. After several peaceful minutes she looked toward the stars and said, "Sometimes the hardest part of losing someone is realizing you must learn who you are without the version of yourself that loved them." I held the warm cup between my hands, feeling the first tears finally begin to fall. As dawn slowly approached, I realized I had survived the longest night of my life. I did not yet know how I would rebuild my future, how I would pay the bills, or how I would explain everything to our children. I only knew that when the sun finally rose above the maple trees the next morning, it would shine on a woman whose heart had been broken, but whose story was not yet finished. The weeks that followed forced me to learn how to live inside a house that no longer sounded the same. Every morning I still woke before sunrise out of habit, reaching toward the empty side of the bed before remembering there was no one there. The silence no longer surprised me, but it still found new ways to hurt. I continued making coffee for 2 during the first week before finally realizing I was pouring half of it down the kitchen sink every morning. Little routines became quiet reminders of a life that had disappeared. I folded only 1 towel after doing laundry. I cooked smaller meals. I no longer waited to hear another car pull into the driveway at the end of the day. Grace and Daniel visited often, each trying to help in their own way. Grace worried constantly, filling my refrigerator with groceries and insisting I call her every evening. Daniel quietly repaired things around the farmhouse that Richard had always promised to fix someday but never found time to finish. Neither of them criticized their father in front of me, although I could see disappointment resting heavily in both of their hearts. One afternoon I sat with my financial records spread across the dining room table. For the first time in more than 3 decades, every bill belonged entirely to me. The mortgage payment, property taxes, utilities, insurance, groceries, and home maintenance suddenly looked much larger than they ever had before. My retirement income would cover the essentials, but there would be very little left afterward. That evening I made a difficult decision. The second car, the one Richard and I had once planned to restore together after retirement, would have to be sold. I cleaned it carefully the following weekend before placing a small handwritten sign in the window. As I watched another family drive it away, I realized I was not simply selling a vehicle. I was letting go of a future that no longer existed. A few days later I climbed onto a ladder with a paintbrush to repair the peeling trim around the porch. Halfway through the project, Lucy walked across the yard carrying lemonade and laughed gently when she saw me balancing on the old ladder. "Your husband would have insisted on doing that himself," she said. I smiled faintly. He would have promised to do it next weekend. Together we finished painting while talking about ordinary things instead of heartbreak. That afternoon taught me something unexpected. Every small task I completed with my own hands quietly replaced a little of the fear I had been carrying. Soon I learned how to repair loose fence boards, replace broken cabinet hinges, trim the rose bushes, and winterize the farmhouse before the first frost arrived. None of those jobs erased the pain Richard had caused, but each one reminded me that I was stronger than I had believed. As autumn settled over the countryside, the rose garden continued blooming beside the front porch exactly as it had every year. One evening I stood among the flowers watching the sun disappear beyond the fields, realizing that nature had never paused to mourn what it had lost. The season simply continued moving forward. For the first time since Richard walked away, I allowed myself to believe that perhaps I could do the same, even if I had to take only one quiet step at a time. Almost a year passed before I heard Richard's name again, and by then I had begun believing the hardest chapter of my life was finally behind me. The farmhouse no longer felt like a place filled with echoes. It had slowly become my home again, shaped not by memories of who had left but by quiet confidence in the woman I was becoming. Every morning I carried a cup of coffee onto the front porch before sunrise, watching the mist drift across the fields while the rose garden slowly awakened beneath the first light of day. The flowers had never stopped blooming simply because someone chose to walk away, and somehow their quiet persistence became my own. One Saturday afternoon Grace arrived carrying groceries and a loaf of fresh bread from the bakery downtown. As we unpacked everything in the kitchen, she hesitated before looking at me with uncertain eyes. "Mom," she said carefully, "there is something I think you should know." I smiled gently. "What is it?" She looked down for a moment before answering. "I saw Dad yesterday." My hands paused while placing canned vegetables inside the pantry. "How is he?" I asked calmly. Grace seemed surprised by the absence of anger in my voice. "He looked happy." She reached for her phone and quietly showed me a photograph someone had shared on social media. Richard stood beside the same young woman who had waited outside our house on the afternoon he left. They were smiling on a beach somewhere along the Gulf Coast, dressed in expensive clothes with a new luxury vehicle parked behind them. Another photograph showed them boarding a cruise ship. Another captured them celebrating at an elegant restaurant surrounded by friends. The captions beneath the pictures spoke about fresh beginnings, new adventures, and finally living life without regrets. Grace quickly put the phone away. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I did not want you to find out from someone else." I simply nodded and continued placing groceries onto the shelves. Later that evening Lucy stopped by with homemade peach pie, having already heard the same stories spreading through town. Small communities have a way of carrying news from one porch to another before the people involved even realize it has begun. "People love talking about shiny things," Lucy said as we shared dessert. "They rarely ask whether those shiny things are built on solid ground." I smiled quietly but said nothing. Deep inside, however, I would be lying if I claimed the photographs had not hurt. There were moments that night when I questioned everything. Had Richard truly found the happiness he insisted he had been missing? Had 34 years with me really been nothing more than a chapter he had outgrown? The questions lingered long after darkness settled across the fields. Yet the following morning I walked into the garden with my pruning shears exactly as I had every Sunday since he left. I carefully removed the dead branches from each rose bush so healthier blooms could grow in their place. As I worked beneath the warm autumn sun, I suddenly realized something the photographs could never reveal. Beautiful pictures capture only a single moment. They never show the roots beneath the soil, the storms a garden survives, or the patient hands that quietly nurture life day after day. Standing among the roses Richard had once planted, I finally understood that appearances could fool an entire world, but they could never change the quiet truth growing inside a faithful heart. Winter arrived quietly, covering the fields around our farmhouse with a thin blanket of snow that softened every familiar corner of the landscape. By then I had settled into a new rhythm of life, one that no longer depended on waiting for someone else to come home. I still missed the future I had once imagined, but I no longer spent my days mourning the past. Instead, I filled them with purpose. One morning, while delivering fresh roses to the church for the Sunday service, several women stopped to compliment the arrangements I had created. One of them smiled warmly and asked, "Have you ever thought about selling these?" I laughed at first, convinced they were simply being kind. Flowers had always been my hobby, not my profession. Yet the idea lingered in my thoughts long after I returned home. That afternoon I walked slowly through my garden, noticing how every flower had survived storms, freezing nights, and months of neglect before blooming again. Their quiet resilience felt strangely familiar. A week later I cleared an old storage room beside the garage that had once been filled with forgotten boxes and worn-out furniture. With Daniel's help, we painted the walls a soft cream color, repaired the shelves, and built a simple wooden workbench where I could arrange bouquets. Grace surprised me with a hand-painted sign that read, "Evelyn's Garden Blooms." The letters were small and elegant, decorated with tiny roses along the edges. When she handed it to me, she smiled and said, "Mom, people deserve to see what you create." I did not know whether anyone would actually buy my arrangements, but I decided to try. My first customer was Lucy, who insisted on paying full price even after I offered her the bouquet as a gift. Soon afterward, a local bakery ordered centerpieces for a community fundraiser. Then a young couple asked me to create flowers for their anniversary dinner. Every arrangement carried a little more confidence than the one before it. I found myself waking each morning excited to choose fresh blooms instead of wondering how I would survive another lonely day. The little workshop slowly filled with buckets of roses, peonies, lilies, eucalyptus, and wildflowers gathered from nearby farms. Music played softly from an old radio while sunlight poured through the windows, making the entire room feel alive. For the first time in many months, I caught myself humming while I worked. One afternoon, as I was wrapping a bouquet in brown paper and ribbon, Grace looked at me with tears glistening in her eyes. "I have not seen you smile like this in a very long time," she whispered. I gently squeezed her hand. "Neither have I." Business remained modest, but it was never really about money. Every bouquet reminded me that beauty could still grow after loss, and every grateful customer reminded me that my life still had meaning beyond being someone's wife. As spring slowly replaced the winter snow, the small sign outside my workshop became a quiet symbol of everything that had changed. The woman who once believed her story had ended the day her husband walked away was beginning to understand that sometimes the closing of one chapter is simply the space where an entirely different life quietly begins to bloom. Nearly 3 years passed more quickly than I ever imagined possible. The little workshop beside my farmhouse had grown into one of the town's favorite places to order flowers for weddings, birthdays, church celebrations, and quiet moments of remembrance. I never became wealthy, but I earned something far more valuable than money. I earned confidence that no one could ever take away from me again. Every arrangement I created carried a small piece of my own journey, reminding me that even the most delicate flowers often bloom after enduring the harshest seasons. My day settled into a peaceful routine. I visited the local flower market before sunrise twice each week, greeted familiar customers by name, and spent long afternoons surrounded by the gentle fragrance of roses, peonies, lavender, and fresh eucalyptus. Grace often helped me organize special orders during busy weekends, while Daniel built additional display shelves after business slowly outgrew the original workspace. The farmhouse felt full again, not because someone had returned, but because love had never truly left. Family dinners had resumed every Friday evening, although they looked different now. We laughed more than we had in years, shared homemade meals around the same dining table, and no one avoided the empty chair that once belonged to Richard. Over time it simply became another chair, no longer carrying the weight of old memories. One rainy Tuesday afternoon I was arranging white lilies for a church memorial service when the bell above the workshop door rang softly. Mrs. Henderson, who owned the bookstore downtown, stepped inside carrying several shopping bags. As I wrapped her bouquet, she smiled and said, "I ran into your former husband last month while visiting Chicago." I looked up with quiet curiosity but remained silent. She continued carefully. "He looked different. Older somehow. Tired." She hesitated before adding, "The young woman was not with him." I simply nodded and wished her a pleasant afternoon. After she left, I returned to trimming flower stems without allowing my thoughts to linger. For the first time, hearing news about Richard did not reopen old wounds. It felt strangely similar to hearing an update about someone I had known many years earlier rather than the man I once believed I would grow old beside. A few weeks later Lucy joined me on the porch after sunset, just as she had done so many times throughout the years. We watched fireflies drift across the garden while the maple trees rustled gently in the warm summer breeze. Do you ever wonder whether he regrets leaving? She asked softly. I smiled before taking a slow sip of tea. I used to wonder every day, I admitted. Now I rarely think about it. Lucy studied my face for a long moment before laughing quietly. That might be the greatest sign that you have truly healed. Her words stayed with me long after she returned home. Healing, I realized, was not forgetting the past. It was reaching the point where the past no longer decided whether today would be joyful or painful. As darkness settled over the countryside, I walked through the rose garden one final time before going inside. The flowers swayed gently beneath the porch light, peaceful and unchanged. I had no idea that somewhere beyond the quiet comfort of that ordinary evening, another life was quietly falling apart, and before long a familiar knock would arrive at the very door where everything had once begun. Late October brought several days of steady rain that wrapped the countryside in a quiet grey mist. Business slowed as fewer customers ventured out, giving me rare afternoons to organize supplies and prepare for the coming holiday season. The gentle sound of rain tapping against the workshop windows had always brought me peace. It reminded me that even storms eventually passed if you simply waited long enough. That particular Thursday evening I closed the shop a little earlier than usual. I carried the remaining roses into the farmhouse, lit a small lamp beside my favorite reading chair, and settled in with a warm cup of chamomile tea while soft instrumental music played in the background. Grace had called earlier to tell me she and Daniel would visit on Saturday for our usual family dinner. We talked about ordinary things, laughing over a recipe that had gone terribly wrong and making plans to decorate the porch with pumpkins before Thanksgiving. It was the kind of simple conversation I once feared I would never enjoy again. After ending the call, I looked around the living room and smiled. The walls had been repainted, new curtains framed the windows, and fresh flowers from my own garden rested on the coffee table. The house no longer looked like a place waiting for someone to return. It looked like a home that had quietly learned how to breathe again. Around 8 o'clock the rain became heavier, and strong wind rattled the maple branches outside. I stood near the front window watching leaves tumble across the yard, grateful that I no longer felt lonely during evenings like this. Solitude had slowly transformed into something peaceful rather than painful. I had just begun washing the last coffee cup when the lights flickered briefly. Seconds later a sharp knock echoed through the front door. I frowned slightly. Visitors were unusual on stormy nights, especially in our quiet neighborhood. Assuming perhaps Lucy needed help after the power surge, I dried my hands and walked toward the entrance. Another knock came, slower this time, followed by complete silence. When I opened the door, the cold autumn wind rushed inside, carrying the scent of rain and wet leaves. Standing beneath the porch light was a man wearing an old brown coat soaked by the storm. His shoulders were slumped, his hair streaked with more gray than I remembered, and deep lines framed a face that seemed years older than its age. For a brief moment I did not recognize him. Then he slowly lifted his eyes, and time seemed to fold back upon itself. Richard stood before me, clutching a small worn duffel bag with trembling hands. The confident smile he had worn the day he walked away had completely disappeared. The expensive suits, polished shoes, and effortless certainty shown in those old photographs had been replaced by exhaustion that could not be hidden. Neither of us spoke. The rain continued falling between us while memories from 3 years earlier silently returned to the same front porch where our lives had separated. Richard lowered his head before quietly saying the first words I had heard from him since the afternoon he left. "Evelyn, I know I do not deserve to be here." His voice sounded fragile, almost unfamiliar. I looked at the stranger standing where my husband once stood, realizing that life had changed both of us in ways neither of us could have imagined. Without saying a word, I waited to hear why the man who had once believed he would never look back had finally found his way home. For several long seconds neither of us moved. Rainwater dripped steadily from Richard's coat onto the old wooden porch while the wind carried fallen maple leaves across the front steps. I searched his face for the man who had confidently walked away 3 years earlier, but he was nowhere to be found. The person standing before me seemed weighed down by something much heavier than age alone. I stepped aside without speaking and left the front door open. Richard hesitated, almost as though he did not believe he had heard the silent invitation. Finally, he entered the house slowly, carefully removing his wet coat before placing it over the back of a chair. His small duffel bag remained beside the door, looking as worn and tired as its owner. I walked into the kitchen and placed a kettle on the stove. Some habits survive even after relationships do not. Whenever someone entered my home on a cold evening, I made tea. That simple act belonged to the kind of woman I wanted to remain regardless of what life had done to me. Richard quietly sat at the dining table while I prepared 2 cups of chamomile tea. Neither of us rushed to speak. The silence between us no longer felt angry. It felt cautious, as though both of us understood that every word carried unusual weight. I placed 1 cup in front of him before taking my own seat across the table. For several moments he simply wrapped his hands around the warm mug without drinking. Finally he looked up. "Thank you," he said softly. I nodded politely. "You said you did not deserve to be here." He lowered his eyes again. "I do not." His voice was almost a whisper. But I did not know where else to go. I waited patiently. Years earlier I would have hurried to fill uncomfortable silence. Life had taught me that people often reveal far more when they are allowed to continue at their own pace. Richard took a slow breath before speaking again. The life I thought I wanted disappeared much faster than I ever imagined. He paused, staring into the steam rising from the tea. "The relationship ended more than a year ago. She left after I lost my job." There was no bitterness in his voice, only exhaustion. He explained that the company where he had worked had gone through major restructuring. His position had been eliminated, and finding new employment at his age proved far more difficult than he expected. The expensive apartment, frequent vacations, and comfortable lifestyle shown in those smiling photographs had quietly disappeared one payment at a time. "I kept believing things would improve," he admitted. "Instead they kept getting smaller." I listened without interrupting. He continued describing months spent moving from one temporary apartment to another, selling personal belongings, and watching savings disappear faster than new opportunities appeared. "I was too ashamed to call Grace or Daniel," he confessed. "Every day I told myself tomorrow would be better." He gave a tired smile that carried no joy. Tomorrow kept becoming another difficult day. I looked at the man sitting across from me and realized something unexpected. 3 years earlier I had imagined this conversation countless times. I thought I would feel satisfaction if life ever forced him to face the consequences of his choices. Instead I felt only quiet sadness for 2 people who had once dreamed of growing old together beneath the same roof. Outside, the rain continued falling against the windows while Richard finally lifted his eyes toward mine. His next words were barely audible, yet they changed the entire evening. "Evelyn," he whispered, "I have spent 3 years wishing I could take back the day I walked out of this house." Richard's confession lingered in the quiet kitchen long after the words had left his lips. Outside, the rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows while the old farmhouse remained wrapped in the same peaceful silence that had once felt unbearable to me. I looked at the man sitting across the table and realized that regret had changed him more deeply than time ever could. His shoulders were bent, his eyes carried constant weariness, and his hands no longer possessed the confidence I remembered from the years when every decision seemed effortless to him. I slowly placed my teacup on the table before speaking. "What happened after you lost your job?" Richard took a deep breath as though gathering the strength to revisit memories he had spent months trying to escape. He explained that after the layoffs he accepted temporary work wherever he could find it, but the positions never lasted long enough to rebuild his finances. Bills continued arriving while opportunities became fewer. The apartment was eventually too expensive to keep, so he moved into a smaller place. Months later he could no longer afford that either. The luxury vehicle had been sold. Most of his furniture had been sold as well. The watch he once proudly wore, the expensive suits, and even the golf clubs he had treasured had quietly disappeared one by one simply to pay rent and groceries. "I kept believing I could fix everything alone," he admitted. "Instead I kept losing another piece of my life." He paused before continuing with visible embarrassment. I was too proud to ask anyone for help. I listened without judgment. Pride had once been one of Richard's greatest strengths when it encouraged him to work hard for our family. Somewhere along the way it had also become one of his greatest weaknesses. He rubbed his tired eyes before speaking again. The hardest part was not losing the money. He looked directly at me for the first time that evening. It was realizing that I had traded 34 years of real love for a life that only looked successful from the outside. His voice broke slightly before he continued. Every place I lived after leaving this house felt temporary. Nothing ever felt like home. The room became quiet again. I glanced toward the family photographs displayed on the nearby shelf. They remained exactly where I had placed them years earlier. Pictures of Grace graduating from college, Daniel proudly holding the first fish he caught with his father, Christmas mornings around the fireplace, birthdays celebrated beneath the maple tree, and one faded wedding photograph taken on a bright spring afternoon decades earlier. Richard noticed the photographs too. Tears slowly gathered in his eyes. I used to think happiness was waiting somewhere else, he whispered. Now I understand it had been sitting around this table all along. I folded my hands together and remained silent for a long moment. 3 years earlier I would have begged him to stay. Tonight I did not need to convince him of anything. Life itself had already spoken far more powerfully than I ever could. Finally I asked the question that had quietly formed in my mind from the moment I opened the front door. Richard, why did you come here tonight? He lowered his head, taking several slow breaths before answering. When he finally spoke, his words carried none of the certainty that had once defined him. Because this is the only place where I ever truly belonged, he said softly. And because I wanted one chance to tell you how deeply sorry I am before it became too late. Richard's apology settled quietly between us, carried only by the gentle sound of rain against the windows and the ticking of the old clock that had hung in our kitchen since our first anniversary. I studied his face for a long moment before answering. There was no anger left inside me, but neither was there the woman who had once depended on his approval to feel complete. 3 years had changed us both, although in very different ways. I folded my hands around my warm cup of tea and spoke softly. I believe you are sorry. Richard closed his eyes for a brief moment, as though those words alone lifted a burden he had carried for years. When he opened them again, tears rested quietly along the edges. Thank you for saying that, he whispered. I know I cannot undo what I did. I nodded. No, you cannot. He looked down at the table again before gathering enough courage to continue. I have replayed that afternoon in my mind thousands of times. I remember standing right here believing I was walking toward a better life. I thought excitement would last forever. I thought comfort and admiration meant happiness. I never understood that I was abandoning the people who had loved me through every ordinary day. His voice trembled as he continued. Every birthday I missed. Every holiday without Grace and Daniel. Every Sunday morning I realized no one was waiting for me. Those memories became heavier than losing any job or any amount of money. I listened quietly. For years I had imagined confronting Richard with every ounce of pain he caused. Now I realized life had already confronted him more honestly than I ever could. Nothing I might say would be more powerful than the truth he had finally discovered himself. After several moments of silence he looked directly at me. Evelyn, I came here tonight because I wanted to ask something that I know I probably do not deserve. He stopped, searching for words. Would you ever consider giving me another chance? The question remained suspended in the quiet room. Outside, lightning briefly illuminated the rose garden beyond the kitchen window before darkness returned. I looked toward the familiar flowers swaying gently in the rain. Those roses had survived freezing winters, scorching summers, and powerful storms because they had deep roots. Our marriage, I realized, had once possessed deep roots as well. But roots alone cannot save a plant after years of neglect if no one chooses to care for it. I slowly turned back toward Richard. Do you know what I spent the first year after you left doing? I asked. He silently shook his head. I learned how to survive without you. The second year I learned how to live without you. The third year I learned how to become happy without you. Tears rolled freely down Richard's face as he listened. I am not telling you those things to hurt you, I continued gently. I am telling you because they are the truth. The woman sitting across from you tonight is not the same woman you left behind. He covered his face with both hands before quietly saying, I know. His shoulders shook with quiet emotion before he finally looked at me again. Even if you never take me back, thank you for letting me tell you how deeply I regret everything. I needed you to know that leaving you was the greatest mistake of my life. I looked at him with genuine compassion, realizing that forgiveness had already begun growing inside my heart long before he ever knocked on my door, but forgiveness and returning to the life we once shared were two very different paths. Richard remained silent after my words, as though he already understood the answer before I spoke it. Aloud. The storm outside had begun to ease, and the steady rain that had surrounded the farmhouse all evening softened into a gentle drizzle. The quiet that filled the kitchen no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt honest. We had finally reached a place where neither of us needed to pretend. I stood and walked toward the window overlooking the rose garden. Tiny drops of rain clung to every blossom, reflecting the warm light from the porch. For years I had believed those flowers reminded me of the marriage we once shared. Now I realized they represented something very different. They represented the life I had patiently rebuilt after everything I once depended upon had fallen apart. Richard slowly joined me by the window. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally I turned toward him with a calmness that surprised even me. Richard, I said gently, I forgave you a long time ago. Tears immediately filled his eyes. He looked as though he wanted to speak, but no words came. I continued softly. I did not forgive you because you asked. I forgave you because carrying resentment was becoming another prison. I wanted to be free. He lowered his head and quietly wiped his eyes. I never deserved that kindness, he whispered. Perhaps not, I answered honestly. But forgiveness is not something people earn. It is something another person chooses to give. He nodded slowly, understanding every word. I returned to my chair while he remained standing for another moment before sitting across from me once again. Does that mean there is still hope for us? He asked carefully. His question carried no expectation this time, only fragile hope. I smiled sadly, not because I wished to hurt him but because I respected him enough to answer truthfully. There is hope for you, I said. There is hope for your future. There is hope that you can rebuild your life. But that does not mean we can return to the life we once had. He closed his eyes, accepting the answer before I finished speaking. I understand, he said quietly. The marriage we shared ended the day you chose to leave, I continued. I spent 3 years learning who Evelyn was without Richard Parker. Along the way I discovered that she was stronger than she ever believed. She built a business she loves. She became closer to her children. She found peace inside this home again. I cannot ask her to become the frightened woman she used to be. Richard nodded slowly. You are right, he admitted. I am asking for something that no longer exists. There was no anger in his voice, only acceptance. I reached across the table and gently placed my hand over his. It was the first time we had touched since the evening he walked away. The gesture carried compassion rather than romance, closure rather than longing. I do not hate you, I said. In many ways I will always care about you because we shared most of our lives together. You are the father of our children, and nothing will ever change that. But caring about someone is not the same as rebuilding a marriage. Richard quietly nodded again, tears slipping down his face without resistance. For the first time that evening he seemed to stop fighting reality. He simply accepted it. In that quiet moment I realized forgiveness had finally completed its work inside both of us, not by restoring what had been lost, but by allowing each of us to walk toward tomorrow without carrying the unbearable weight of yesterday. The rain finally stopped shortly before midnight, leaving the farmhouse surrounded by fresh autumn air and the quiet fragrance of wet earth and roses. Richard stood slowly from his chair and looked around the familiar kitchen one last time. His eyes rested on the old family photographs, the handmade curtains, and the maple tree visible through the window. Every corner held memories that could never be purchased, replaced, or recreated somewhere else. He picked up his worn coat and small duffel bag before turning toward me with a peaceful expression I had not seen on his face in many years. "Thank you for opening the door," he said softly. "You gave me something I did not expect to receive." I smiled gently. "What was that?" He paused before answering. "Peace." Those simple words settled warmly inside the room. I walked with him to the front porch where the clouds had begun to separate, revealing a sky filled with quiet stars. The old porch light cast a gentle glow across the wooden steps that had witnessed both the ending of our marriage and the closing of one of the most difficult chapters of our lives. Richard stopped before walking down the steps. "Please tell Grace and Daniel that I love them," he said quietly. "I will find the courage to speak with them myself someday, if they are willing." I nodded. "That choice belongs to them now. Just as mine belonged to me." He accepted those words without argument. For the first time since his return, he did not ask for anything more. He simply offered a grateful smile before slowly walking toward the road beneath the maple trees. I remained on the porch until his figure disappeared into the peaceful darkness. Surprisingly, I did not feel sadness. I did not feel triumph either. What I felt was completion. The story that had once defined my entire life had finally reached its natural ending. 2 days later, Grace and Daniel arrived for our usual Saturday dinner. The aroma of homemade chicken soup filled the kitchen while fresh bread cooled on the counter beside a bouquet of late autumn flowers from my shop. During the meal, I gently told them about Richard's unexpected visit. Both listened quietly without interruption. Grace reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "How are you feeling?" she asked. I smiled honestly. "Lighter than I have felt in years." Daniel nodded thoughtfully before speaking. "I always hoped you would find peace, Mom. I never cared whether that meant getting back together. I only wanted you to stop carrying the hurt." His words reminded me how much healing had touched our entire family, not only me. Later that evening, after everyone returned home, I carried a cup of tea onto the porch and settled into the old rocking chair beneath the familiar maple tree. The rose garden rested peacefully in the cool evening air, waiting for another spring that would surely come in its own time. I thought about everything life had taught me over the previous 3 years. Love is precious, but self-respect is equally precious. Forgiveness is powerful, but it does not erase consequences. Sometimes the greatest act of compassion is allowing someone to leave with dignity while refusing to abandon the life you fought so hard to rebuild. I gently removed my wedding ring from the small chain where I had kept it close to my heart since the divorce. Instead of placing it back on my finger, I carefully laid it inside the old wooden keepsake box beside our family photographs. It would always remain part of my story, but it would no longer define my future. As the evening breeze carried the scent of roses across the porch, I looked toward the peaceful farmhouse that had once seemed filled only with loneliness. Now it stood as a quiet reminder that endings are not always failures. Sometimes they are simply the place where a stronger, wiser, and more grateful life finally begins. Several weeks passed after Richard's visit, and life settled into a peaceful rhythm once again. The flower shop remained busy as neighbors prepared for Thanksgiving, and the farmhouse felt warmer than ever with friends, family, and familiar routines filling each day. I no longer found myself looking toward the road or wondering whether another unexpected knock might come. That chapter had quietly closed. One crisp November afternoon, as golden leaves drifted beneath the maple tree, Lucy stopped by the shop carrying her favorite blueberry pie. We shared tea at the small table near the front window while customers came and went with cheerful greetings. After a comfortable silence, she smiled at me and asked, "Have you heard from Richard?" I nodded gently. "He wrote me a letter last week." Lucy looked surprised but waited patiently for me to continue. I explained that Richard had found a modest apartment in a nearby town and accepted part-time work at a local hardware store. The position was simple, but he wrote that honest work and peaceful sleep felt more valuable now than any title he had once held. He also shared that he had finally spoken with Grace and Daniel. The conversations had not been easy, but both children had agreed to meet him for lunch. Rebuilding trust would take time, yet they were willing to begin with small steps. Lucy smiled warmly. "That sounds like healing." I nodded. "It is. Just not the kind either of us expected years ago." That evening I read Richard's letter once more before placing it carefully inside the keepsake box beside the old wedding ring. His handwriting carried a humility I had never seen before. He thanked me again for listening without bitterness and wrote that my forgiveness had encouraged him to become a better father and a better man during whatever years remained to him. He ended the letter by saying he no longer prayed for another chance to restore our marriage. Instead, he prayed that I would continue living the joyful life I had built with such courage. I folded the letter slowly, feeling gratitude instead of sadness. The following Sunday Grace and Daniel joined me for dinner as they often did. They spoke openly about meeting their father. Grace admitted the conversation had been emotional, while Daniel said seeing genuine humility in Richard had softened some of the anger he carried for years. Neither pretended everything had been repaired overnight, but both agreed that forgiveness allowed them to move forward without carrying resentment into their own families. Listening to them, I realized that healing had quietly spread far beyond my own heart. It had reached our children as well. After dinner we gathered on the porch beneath the familiar maple tree, wrapped in warm blankets while watching the sunset paint the fields in shades of amber and crimson. Laughter filled the cool evening air as we shared old family stories that belonged to happier times. For the first time in many years those memories no longer carried pain. They had simply become treasured chapters in a life that continued to grow. As I looked across the peaceful rose garden, I understood that some endings are not measured by who stays together forever. Sometimes the truest victory is watching broken hearts become whole again, each person walking a different road with kindness instead of bitterness, carrying gratitude instead of regret, and discovering that even after great loss, life still has beautiful seasons waiting just beyond the next sunrise. Winter gradually gave way to spring, and with the changing seasons the farmhouse seemed to bloom right alongside the rose garden. Fresh blossoms surrounded the porch where so many important moments had unfolded, and the little flower shop became busier than ever as neighbors returned to prepare their gardens. Every morning I unlocked the front door with quiet gratitude, no longer wondering what life might have been if the past had unfolded differently. Instead, I found myself appreciating the life that existed exactly as it was. Grace visited often, bringing homemade desserts and stories about her growing family. Daniel stopped by on weekends to help maintain the old barn and repair anything that needed attention around the property. Lucy remained my closest friend, never missing an opportunity to arrive with warm conversation and another pie she insisted was better than the last one. Together we laughed more than we ever had before, proving that happiness often returns quietly rather than all at once. Richard also continued rebuilding his own life. Several months after his unexpected visit, he became a familiar presence in Grace and Daniel's lives again, meeting them occasionally for lunch or helping Daniel with small home improvement projects. Their relationship recovered slowly, one honest conversation at a time. There were no dramatic reunions, only consistent effort, sincere humility, and the willingness to accept that trust grows at its own pace. I heard about these moments through our children, and every update brought me quiet satisfaction. Not because I wished to return to the past, but because I believed every family deserves the opportunity to heal where healing is still possible. One peaceful Saturday afternoon I walked through the rose garden carrying a small basket and pruning shears. The flowers had grown fuller than ever, filling the air with gentle fragrance beneath the familiar maple tree. As I worked, I realized that the garden reflected my own journey. Some branches had needed to be cut away before new growth could appear. Some seasons had seemed painfully empty before beautiful blossoms returned. Yet every spring arrived exactly when it was meant to. I smiled to myself, grateful that I had trusted life enough to keep planting even during the years when nothing seemed to bloom. Later that evening I sat once again in the old rocking chair on the porch with a warm cup of tea resting in my hands. The sunset painted the fields in soft shades of gold while birds settled quietly into the surrounding trees. I looked toward the keepsake box resting safely inside the house. Within it remained our wedding photographs, Richard's letter, and the wedding ring that had once symbolized my entire future. They were no longer reminders of heartbreak. They had become reminders of growth. They represented chapters that shaped me without controlling the person I had become. I closed my eyes for a brief moment and breathed deeply, thankful for every lesson hidden inside both joy and sorrow. If someone had asked me years earlier whether a broken heart could ever become whole again, I might have answered with uncertainty. Now I knew the answer. Hearts do heal. Families can find peace even when they cannot return to what they once were. Forgiveness can free two people without requiring them to walk the same road again. Life does not always reward us by restoring what we lost. Sometimes it gives us something even more valuable, the wisdom to cherish what remains, the courage to embrace what comes next, and the quiet confidence to understand that the happiest chapters are often the ones we never expected to write.